Okay, I'm unmuted. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Susan B. Anthony's 202nd birthday celebration, sponsored by the Susan B. Anthony Birthplace Museum. My name is Jim Lohman, and I'm on the boards of both the Adams Historical Society and the Susan B. Anthony Birthplace Museum. The museum has celebrated Susan's birthday since 2007, making this the occasion. In the past, we have hosted not only historians and reenactors, but also dancers, musicians, and the Berkshire Quilters and the recreation of Susan's quilt made at age 7. Thank you all for dedicating your time today towards celebrating the woman we know and love, who forever changed the course of American history when she devoted her life to fighting for women's rights. We are so delighted that we have 145 folks signed up for today for this event, and we are so grateful to those who donated for their ticket as well. The Susan B. Anthony Birthplace Museum, Inc. is a not-for-profit corporation dedicated to preserving the birthplace and raising public awareness of the wide-ranging legacy of that great social reformer, who was a pioneering feminist and suffragist, as well as a noteworthy figure in the 19th century movements opposing alcohol, abortion, and slavery. As part of its mission, the museum highlights the familial and regional influences which shaped Susan's early life by displaying the textiles and furnishings of that period, as well as the literature and other memorabilia associated with her later career. In the latter portion of today's birthday event, 2 young women, interns from the birthplace, will present a reenactment of the mill girls who lived in the attic of the Anthony homestead between 1820 and 1826. Faith and Hope Motta from North Adams will give us a glimpse into what their lives may have been like. But first, I want to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Erika Bachiochi. Erika is a legal scholar specializing in equal protection jurisprudence, feminist legal theory, Catholic social teaching, and sexual ethics. Oh dear, somebody's saying, okay. As a 2018 visiting scholar at Harvard Law School, she is also a senior fellow at the Abigail Adams Institute in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where she founded and directs the Wollstonecraft Project. Erika recently published her newest book, The Rights of Women, Reclaiming a Lost Vision, which was published by Notre Dame University Press in 2021. Her essays have appeared in publications such as the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, Christian Bioethics at Oxford University, the New York Times, CNN.com, Politico, SCOTUS blogs, and National Affairs. Erika comes to us live from her home in Boston. As an expert on early British feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, she will be speaking to us today about Wollstonecraft's influence on American 19th century. Before I give the floor to Erika, I want to let all of our attendees know that we will have a 10 to 15 minute period after her talk for any related questions. You can submit your questions using the chat box toward the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to submit your questions during or after her talk. I will now turn over the floor and spotlight to you, Erika.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you, albeit on Zoom. And I am going to start my presentation by sharing my slides. So in 1906, just weeks before Susan B. Anthony's death in March of that year, Anthony offered her last speech to a women's suffrage convention, 14 years still before the ratification of the amendment that bore her name. During that final speech, she made tribute to Mary Wollstonecraft, the 18th century British philosopher who in 1792 had penned her now famous Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Anthony told the audience that day, "I never saw that great woman, Mary Wollstonecraft, but I have read her eloquent and unanswerable arguments in behalf of the liberty of womankind." 2 years earlier, Anthony had donated her copy of Wollstonecraft's treatise to the Library of Congress with the following inscription: "Presented to the Library of Congress by a great admirer of this early work for women's right to equality, ever penned by a woman." Anthony's admiration for Wollstonecraft ran deep and was decades long. When Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton founded their weekly newspaper, The Revolution, in 1868, they hung Wollstonecraft's portrait alongside that of Lucretia Mott on the office wall. Throughout that first year, they reprinted The Rights of Woman section by section in The Revolution's pages. Indeed, University of Notre Dame Wollstonecraft scholar Eileen Botting argues that of the many European theorists who influenced the 19th century American women's rights advocates, none enjoyed the same iconic stature as Wollstonecraft, and most were readers of The Rights of Women themselves. So who was Mary Wollstonecraft, and how did her thought inspire these early women's rights advocates in our own country? Today, I hope to answer these questions for you. I'll start with a bit of background on Wollstonecraft, situating her thought in its historical context, and then give you a sense of her moral and philosophical outlook. I then want to take 3 different areas where I regard her as particularly influential. First, at Seneca Falls itself, and in how the authors of the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions articulated many of their arguments. Second, in the popular concept, voluntary motherhood. And finally, if briefly, with regard to the winning arguments for suffrage itself. Wollstonecraft's best known work, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, was published just 2 years after she anonymously published A Vindication of the Rights of Men, the most widely read critique of Edmund Burke's famous 1790 treatise in defense of the English monarchy. Wollstonecraft wrote these treatises during a time of marked political and social change. The American and then French revolutions had just thrown off old forms of hereditary rule in their respective attempts to enact new forms of republican government based on God-given rights derived from the moral status of human beings as rational creatures. In both The Rights of Men and The Rights of Women, Wollstonecraft articulated this now familiar rationale for civil and political rights in the modern era. She then artfully extended its reach to women. Yet, unlike most of her contemporaries, Wollstonecraft's defense of rights was inspired by a far older view of the human person, one which exalted the common human pursuit of wisdom and virtue above all else. So like ancient thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, she believed that human beings' attainment of virtue, not their attainment of property, wealth, power, or status, would guarantee personal, familial, and societal happiness. As she wrote most famously, society can only be happy and free in proportion as it is virtuous. Yet even as she shared the ancient view of human excellence as a kind of imitation of or participation in the highest good or the divine, unlike the ancient, sought to universalize this quintessentially human quest beyond the landed classes. Unlike the ancients then, she recognized the dignity of all persons, rational creatures who are radically equal in their dependence upon and responsibility to God. That is, persons are equal in dignity, thought Wollstonecraft, because each one, whatever his or her sex, race, or social creature capable of moral development. Men and women are endowed with the ennobling capacity to reason, to rise in excellence by the exercise of powers implanted for that purpose. The capacity to employ reason, to govern our appetites, and to direct us to live according to what is most excellent in us is that which makes us distinct from the animals. In what respect are we superior to the brute creation if intellect is not allowed to be the guide of passion? Brutes hope and fear, love and hate, but without a capacity to improve, a power of turning these passions to good or evil, they neither acquire virtue nor wisdom. Why? because the Creator has not given them reason. But such personal freedom and independence does not spring forth organically within a child. One must be taught, desires must be schooled. The familial environment and society in which one lives must encourage each person's intellectual and moral development. And so she especially praised the work of parents, those who prepare young people to encounter the evils of life with dignity, to acquire wisdom and virtue by the exercise of their own faculties. Indeed, her advice in this regard to parents was plentiful. If you wish to make your son rich, pursue one course. If you are only anxious to make him virtuous, you must take another. But do not imagine that you can bound from one road to the other without losing your way. Such virtue is cultivated, Wollstonecraft thought, in the daily obligations of life, obligations which spring forth from our given nature as rational, moral, and familial beings. Duties to self, to develop one's rational faculties and master one's appetites. To family, to care for one's dependent children, spouse, and elderly parents. To fellow creatures, to be useful in one's work and to respect the human dignity of all others, regardless of social status. And to God, to pursue truth and goodness and to trust in his providential designs. And so, and I want to underscore this point, these concrete day-to-day responsibilities to others are the first reality. Rights for Wollstonecraft are then born of and enable us to carry out those responsibilities. And so Wollstonecraft's chief aim was to set things between the sexes aright. For in doing that, the whole human race, divided as it was between the sexes, might have hope of progressing in virtue and thus finding happiness. Wollstonecraft thus wished to transform intimate relations between men and women into those governed by mutual respect and affection. In her view, these relationships were too often manipulative and transactional, like a commercial enterprise, or worse, entirely destructive of human dignity. This debasement was of great consequence, and not just for the persons involved. Moral corruption of this most fundamental human relationship sowed corruption throughout the whole of society. To this end, Wollstonecraft repeatedly condemned the want of chastity in men, the quote, grand source, she writes, of many of the quote, physical and moral evils that torment mankind and degrade and destroy women. Wollstonecraft believed strongly that many men in her time did not arrive at true maturity because of sexual misadventures early on. Quote, thanks to early debauchery, there are scarcely men in their outward form. These, quote, overgrown children had missed the essential schooling of their desires, which ought to have taken place in their youth. Rather, she thought, if men were more self-possessed, with a greater respect for the well-being of women as rational creatures made in God's image, women would not feel the need to self-objectify, degrading themselves into mere objects of men's arousal. And yet, libertine men's ill respect for both women's reproductive capacity and sexist, quote, parental design placed women in especially precarious situations. Forgetting the, quote, noble use of sex, men with women indulge their desires, sometimes leaving women too weak to carry out the maternal duties that sexual intercourse potentially sets before them. They have sacrificed to lasciviousness the parental affection that ennobles instinct. And the woman, now pregnant and abandoned by her sexual partner, may seek to either destroy the embryo in womb or cast it off when born. Wollstonecraft blasts the idea that humanity had come so far from the barbarism of antiquity, as she says, at which time parents routinely exposed children who were born but unwanted. She returns to the ends of sex implanted by nature. Nature in everything demands respect, but those who violate her laws seldom violate them with impunity. Surely nature never intended that women, by satisfying an appetite, should frustrate the very purpose for which it was implanted. Wollstonecraft demanded instead that in situations such as these, the father maintain both mother and child. Such an expectation of paternal responsibility, she argues, might well bring an end to, quote, an abuse that has an equally fatal effect on population and morals. Wollstonecraft believed that true domestic affections, man for woman and woman for man, could rather channel sexual energies away from the pursuit of pleasure to something that could transform society itself. A man's love for his wife and children could expand his heart and so free him from narrow self-regard. Quote, the tenderness which a man will feel for the mother of his children is an excellent substitute for the ardor of unsatisfied passion. Cold would be the heart of a husband were he not rendered unnatural by early debauchery, who did not feel more delight at seeing his child suckled by its mother than the most artful wanton tricks could ever raise. Indeed, engaged in attentive fatherhood was the very best means to direct men's desires profitably by bringing them into a life of shared domesticity. And given men's power and influence in society, such an orientation would yield benefits well beyond the good of his wife and children. Listen to how she contrasts the ill effects of the libertine man with the noble citizenship of the husband and father. From the lax morals and deprived affections of the libertine, what results? A finical man of taste who is only anxious to secure his own private gratifications and to maintain his rank in society. But the character of a husband and a father forms the citizen imperceptibly, producing a sober manliness of thought and orderly behavior. By trading the libertine lifestyle for that first domestic affection, men and women could refine their humanity and thereby transform the world. So 3/4 of a century after she wrote, Wollstonecraft's vision of rights as necessary to carry out responsibilities was taken up by the earliest women's rights advocates at Seneca Falls. But earlier even than that, we have evidence that Abigail Adams, the country's founding mother, who urged her husband in 1776 to, quote, remember the ladies, referred to herself as Wollstonecraft's pupil. Decades later, in the 1820s, Lucretia Mott, a Quaker minister who would become a powerful voice in the abolitionist movement, devoured Wollstonecraft's Rights of Women 20 years before Mott would become a leader of the early women's rights movement. Like Wollstonecraft, Mott believed that women's enhanced opportunity in education, civic life, and the professions were to redound to the benefit of their moral duties as wives and mothers and as citizens more generally, and so to the nation as a whole. Like Wollstonecraft, Mott critiqued women's preoccupation with romantic novels and, quote, outward adorning, along with the flattery they seemed to enjoy receiving as the, quote, mere plaything or toy of society. Many know that Mott met Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1840 at the World's Anti-Slavery Convention in London. Stanton recounts in her memoirs that during her time there, when she and Mott and other women abolitionists were barred from participating in the convention, Stanton and Mott found themselves in a lengthy discussion of Mary Wollstonecraft, her social theories, and her demands of equality for women. Though Stanton had apparently read Wollstonecraft before that conversation, the conversation itself and her ongoing relationship with Mott inspired Stanton deeply and served as the catalyst for her to join the cause of women's rights in addition to her abolitionist work. You'll note on the slide there that the history of women's suffrage, that volume Stanton and Anthony wrote with Matilda Gage and was the source of this quote, is itself affectionately inscribed to the memory of Mary Wollstonecraft, who is listed first among a host of other women's rights advocates. Stanton and Mott went on together to author the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions for the first Women's Rights Convention held in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. The document resounds in themes Wollstonecraft herself had articulated more than a half century before. Although the Declaration of Sentiments made an initial plea for the franchise, their most controversial request, even among the hundreds of people attending at the convention, much of the document concerned the legal and social inequality of women and the silencing of women's, quote, improper voices in public, especially as many of these women sought to publicly decry the horrors of slavery, the treatment of women in marriage especially, and the growing abuse of alcohol. One resolution notably took issue with the prevailing sexual double standard, and so was deeply reminiscent of a key thread in Wollstonecraft's thought. Quote, that the same amount of virtue, delicacy, and refinement of behavior that is required of women in the social state should also be required of man, and the same transgression should be visited with equal severity on both man and woman. These women were not seeking to absolve themselves from cultural expectations of virtue, Rather, they demanded that the same be expected of men. But more foundational still, and again following Wollstonecraft, they resolved that the, quote, equality of human rights results from the, quote, identity of the race in capacities and responsibilities. And as authority for this claim, they, like her, relied upon a higher law of nature. Remember Wollstonecraft's talk of the eternal rule of right. That is, a law that is, the Declaration says, superior in obligation to any other, and binding all over the globe in all countries and at all times. No human laws are of any validity if contrary to this. The Declaration concluded with the following lengthy resolution, a kind of summary that again echoed Wollstonecraft's thought, expounding upon the right and duty of both women and men to exercise the God-given capabilities of their common rational nature. Quote, British philosopher's work in her concluding speech of the National Women's Rights Convention in 1866. Quote, young women of America, I want you to make yourselves acquainted with the history of the women's rights movement from the days of Mary Wollstonecraft. All honor to Mary Wollstonecraft. Her name shall yet go forth and stand as the pioneer of this movement. Another prominent student of Wollstonecraft's was Sarah Grimke, also a Quaker and noted abolitionist. Motta had also introduced Wollstonecraft to Grimke, who read The Rights of Woman before penning her own influential letters on the equality of the sexes and the condition of women in 1838. Although Grimke also did not expressly acknowledge her reliance on Wollstonecraft, the book shares similar philosophical themes and arguments. Both defend the moral and intellectual equality of the sexes as a means not to abdicating familial and social duties, but to fulfilling them. Grimke's most famous work can be remembered best for her quip. I ask no favors for my sex. I surrender not our claim to equality. All I ask of our brethren is that they will take their feet from off our necks and permit us to stand upright on the ground which God destined us to occupy. But what is less remembered today is that Grimke was an ardent advocate of what the earliest women's rights advocates called voluntary motherhood. Indeed, she may have been the first to use the term in her provocative article, Marriage, written sometime in the 1850s. So I now move on to the second point of influence, or at least similarity, the movement's demand for voluntary motherhood. Historian Linda Gordon writes that of no other question did 19th century women's rights advocates agree more universally than the concept of voluntary motherhood. Bringing together otherwise disparate elements of the early women's rights movement in the United States, Quaker abolitionist Sarah Grimke, radical suffragist Elizabeth Cady Stanton, free love advocates Tennessee Claflin and Victoria Woodhull, and Christian moral reformer Frances Willard were among those who argued that justice required that men take seriously the asymmetrical consequences of sexual intercourse and abstain from sex when their sexual partner, usually wife, was not ready to have a child. Whatever their differences about other matters, these women universally agreed that it was in the sexual relationship between men and women that authentic equality and harmonious companionship would ultimately be found or neglected. And so it is here too that they follow Wollstonecraft closely. The voluntary motherhood movement believed that by attempting to separate sex from childbearing, increasingly available, albeit legally prohibited abortion, and nascent birth control methods further emboldened vicious men to engage in infidelity, promiscuity, prostitution, and marital rape. After all, husbands at this time held inordinate legal and physical power over their wives. They also, as Wollstonecraft put it, were more under the influence of their appetites than women were, even as women were the ones who bore the asymmetrical consequences of sex. Grimke provocatively describes the situation some married women found themselves in. Oh, how many women who have entered the marriage relation in all purity and innocence, expecting to realize in it the completion of their own halfness, the rounding out of their own being, the blending of their holiest instincts with those of a kindred spirit, have too soon discovered that they were chattels personal to be used and abused at the will of their master. And how many so-called wives rise in the morning oppressed with a sense of degradation from the fact that their chastity has been violated, their holiest instincts degraded, and that too 1,000 times harder to bear because so-called husband has been the perpetrator of the unnatural crime. Grimke spoke for the whole movement when she responded to these injustices by saying that since, quote, upon woman alone dissolves the necessity of nurturing unto the fullness of life that being within her, women must have a right to say no to sex, or as she put it, control all preliminaries. If men had had these burdens to bear, she concludes, common sense and common justice would confer this right upon them. In the view of the women and men who practiced and advocated voluntary motherhood, a man's deep respect for his wife, and especially for the consequences she might endure as a result of sexual intercourse, was what inspired him to master his appetites. Monogamy and family harmony, in this view, would be promoted by working to instill in men a sense of self-governance, and in women, a sense of sovereignty over their bodies. Men should conform themselves to the asymmetrical realities of sex, rather than being ruled by their desires. Recognizing these asymmetrical consequences of sexual intercourse for women, radical suffragist Victoria Woodhull well articulated the concept of voluntary motherhood. Quote, when women rises from sexual slavery into freedom, into the ownership and control of her sexual organs, and man is obliged to respect this freedom, then will this instinct become pure and holy. But owning and controlling one's sexual organs over their own bodies, in part because they were, quote, directly charged with the care of embryonic life. As such, they could claim no legitimate authority to engage, in Woodhull's words, in, quote, antenatal murder of undesired children. Thus, women's rights advocates like Woodhull and Grimke also believed that the practice of voluntary motherhood was an essential response to the rising crime of abortion. Abortion in 19th century America was a strongly condemned practice, with the New York Times in 1871 calling abortion the, quote, evil of the age. And the women's rights advocates offered no exception. So for instance, Woodhull was not only an ardent champion of constitutional equality for women and the first woman to run for president and testify before Congress, she was also an advocate for the rights of children, rights that, as she said, quote, begin while yet they remain the fetus. In this next quote, she articulates the common logic of viewing abortion as no different from infanticide, as the self-same life is taken. Let me read the whole quote. Many women who would be shocked at the very thought of killing their children after birth deliberately destroy them previously. If there's any difference in the actual crime, we should be glad to have those who practice the latter pointed out. The truth of the matter is that it is just as much a murder to destroy life in its embryonic condition as it is to destroy it after the fully developed form is attained, for it is the self-same life that is taken. Now, the leading male opponents of abortion, and here I have on a slide language from the American Medical Association, similarly regarded abortion as, quote, an unwarrantable destruction of human life. But many of these doctors also argued that the act was a most selfish means for women to, quote, shirk their marital duties. The women's rights advocates strenuously objected to this characterization, with Gage here on the slide laying the blame for the crime of child murder at the door of the male sex. Rather, and here I have an editorial, and you can follow along by following the bold I have an editorial here from The Revolution, where they maintained that women were forced into the, quote, horrible crime of child murder by the poor circumstances of their lives. Like Wollstonecraft before them, the 19th century women's rights advocates thus sought to call attention to the, quote, root of the evil that would drive women to such acts of desperation. In a word, quote, the wife has no right over her own body. Quote, no matter what her condition, physical or mental, no matter how ill-prepared she may feel herself for maternity, the demands of his passion must never be refused. He thinks or cares nothing for the possible result of his gratification. This evil arises, then, the editorial concludes, from the legally protected male sexual prerogative and the, quote, false position women occupied in civilized society. As guilty as the woman is for, quote, committing the deed, it is the man who, quote, drove her to the desperation which impelled her to the crime. Sarah Norton, who worked successfully for the admission of women to Cornell University in 1870, Put it more succinctly still, is there no remedy for all this anti-natal child murder? And then echoing the Seneca Falls resolution that responded to the sexual double standard decades before, perhaps there will come a time when the unchastity in men will be placed on an equality with the unchastity of women, and when the right of the unborn will not be denied or interfered with. Under her own name, Stanton argued that it was the social and legal degradation of women that was causing some to murder their children either before or after. But she writes, is the quote, education and enfranchisement of women. Women's rights advocates thus lamented not only social and economic conditions that push some women. The sexual double standard tolerated male sexual adventure, even as it blamed women for ending up unwillingly pregnant as a result. They therefore fought judicial decisions that ignored these mitigating circumstances in women's lives, even as they sought to better the conditions of women's lives. For they knew that laws that protected unborn children would not on their own alter the desperation of those women who sought out abortion in the first place. And so they focused their efforts on those educational, cultural, and legal means that to their mind would improve women's lives. Sexual self-ownership and fertility education, ameliorating women's educational and economic situations, support for unwed mothers and their infants, and eventually enfranchisement. Okay, so let's very, very briefly turn to suffrage itself. Now I have found, oh, whoops, I missed that quote. I have found no evidence that Wollstonecraft was an explicit source for the early women's rights movement's push for the vote. After all, Wollstonecraft herself was writing in the late 18th century and argued for civil and rights and political representation for women, but not explicitly, to my knowledge, for women's suffrage. That said, think, if you will, about the ways in which the arguments for suffrage changed over the course of the many decades that the suffragists advanced them. At the beginning of the suffragists' efforts, for instance, Anthony and others argued that based on US citizenship alone, women had the right to vote. Anthony even attempted to vote in the presidential election of 1872. At her trial, after being arrested for this effort, she appealed to liberal social contract theory, in particular, the political philosophy of John Locke. Quote, "You have trampled underfoot every vital principle of our government. My natural rights, my civil rights, my political rights, my judicial rights are all alike ignored. Robbed of my fundamental privilege of citizenship, I'm degraded from status of citizen to that of a subject." Equal citizenship in this view included both civil and political rights. Women were citizens, thus civil and political rights were justly theirs too. Other suffragists argued for civil and political rights based on the plain language of the new Reconstruction Amendments themselves, and some, like Virginia Minor, took her case all the way to the Supreme Court in 1875. Of course, she lost. Many often assume that women's suffrage was so hard to come by because far too many male voters viewed women as unequal to men or as otherwise unfit for civic life. In the words of an infamous Supreme Court case in 1873, quote, "The natural and proper timidity and delicacy which belongs to the female sex evidently unfits it for many of the occupations of civil life." Though this view was certainly held by some, the more prevalent view held by anti-suffrage men and women alike was that women's interests as citizens were not abrogated by the absence of the franchise at all. Women's interests were just properly represented by their husbands in a kind of vicarious family representation. Many of the anti-suffragists respected the strength and wisdom of women, but thought that women should be kept pure from the rancor of the public sphere so they could properly do their more essential work, inculcating virtue in their children, and well, especially their sons. Their role as small r Republican mothers was deeply respected. So if suffragists were to win the vote, then they were going to have to change the hearts and minds of men and women state by state, and they did, capturing the franchise in 15 states by the time the 19th Amendment granted women in every state the federal right to vote in 1920. But the winning arguments the suffragists began to employ were, by and large, arguments that extolled not just individual rights, as Anthony had first done, but the importance of the family and family responsibilities in American life and women's premier role in it. Joining forces with women actively engaged in the temperance movement and other social reform movements, the suffragists argued that women's powerful moral voice should not be limited to its domestic influence or the force of moral suasion in society. In particular, Women Christian Temperance Union President Frances Willard was finally able to persuade hundreds of thousands of devotees in state after state that women could enhance their moral influence in society if they engaged in the political realm too. Indeed, women needed the vote if they were going to bring about the successful moral reforms she and others hoped for. Fittingly, Willard referred to the franchise as the home protection ballot. So again, although Wollstonecraft's influence here is not at all historically explicit, it was only as the late 19th century suffrage movement made the conceptual shift away from the more Lockean declarations of abstract universal rights to articulating a more complete and concrete Wollstonecraftian understanding of rights as necessary to fulfill family and social responsibilities, that they were able to be persuasive.
We do have another treat for you. In 2021, a young girl contacted the museum expressing her interest in being a volunteer. Her name is Faith Motta, and she is a young high school student pursuing opportunities in history, public speaking, and acting. Faith is not only an intelligent, charismatic young scholar, but also a descendant of Susan B. Anthony herself. Her family currently sits on our Susan B. Anthony Birthplace Museum Honorary Board of Anthony family ancestors. Because they share a distant grandfather with the Anthony family, Faith had the idea of writing and producing a short film that gives viewers a feel for what it was like to live and work for the Anthony family in the early 1820s. She quickly roped in her sister Hope to star in the film. They and their family have worked diligently over the past few months to put together a short production called The Anthony Family Mill Girls, and are excited to share it with you. Please give us a moment as we air the film for the first time on Zoom today. Be aware that unfortunately there may be a lag while watching the video. However, we already have the Mill Girls production posted on our YouTube account, and the link for that will be posted in the bar. So feel free to watch the production in higher quality after we end this birthday celebration. Thank you. One moment, please.
Dear Journal, I have managed to steal a few minutes to myself to write. I hope that Ruby and Mrs. Anthony won't notice me missing for a little while. I just love this new journal Mrs. Anthony gave to me. It's beautiful. It seems like my life is always so busy, and I love that Mrs. Anthony noticed that. She reminds me of Mom. I miss home terribly on days like this. The Anthonys are such a close family, and their love for each other makes me miss the farm even more. The Anthonys try to make my sister Ruby and me feel like we're a part of their family, but we still miss our family every day. Yes, we've made good wages at Mr. Anthony's mill, but boy, do my hands and feet feel it. The blisters on my hands hurt so the blisters will soon turn to calluses. So that's something to look forward to. Even on Sunday, my day of rest, I have a mountain that are as big as Mount Greylock. Well, maybe that's not true, but you know what I mean. And the summers here are unbearably hot, and the winters can be as cold as 20 below sometimes. Some days at the mill, the cold rises right up from the hard factory floor through my thin boots and right up my legs. I have to step from side to side to keep my legs from freezing. Mrs. Anthony tries to make sure that we are comfortable, though. She gives us sturdy wool yarn to knit thick wool stockings and lets us use warm hand-me-down shawls that the Anthony girls used to wear. But I must remember that we will soon have enough money for our brother to go to university. Once he goes to university, we can go home. I don't mean to complain, so until then, I'll work my hardest, be thankful for my blessings, and secretly hope for different days to come. I am grateful the Anthonys are kind to us. If it weren't for their kindness, my father wouldn't be able to afford the farm. Although I'm still getting used to Adams, Massachusetts, I feel certain parts of it are already home. Sometimes
You were supposed to have brought water 10 minutes ago, and you even left the bucket outside. Mrs. Anthony has been waiting for you. We can't start dinner until you bring the water inside. What are you even doing out here anyways? It's freezing.
Well, Ruby, I'm writing.
Writing? Since when do you write? And who are you writing for anyway?
Well, I thought it'd be a nice change of pace for chores. I'm not writing for anyone. Besides, Miss Anthony gave me the journal. She saw me trying to read the Anthony Children's Primer, and she wants me to learn. She wants you to learn.
A nice change of pace. Since when do you think you can take a break from chores and go write? Do you really think we could learn to read and write?
Many mill girls already do. Betsy can write. And I saw Sally writing once too. Why can't we, Ruby? I know we can.
That may be so, Margaret, but Mr. Anthony didn't ask those girls to come and live here. We owe it to the Anthonys, as well as to Mom and Dad, to do the best we can. Now, come inside and bring the water, okay? Mrs. Anthony's making my favorite pie for dessert, so hurry up, okay? And put this on. It's freezing out here. And don't forget the water, okay? Margaret, come on, hurry up.
You're right, Ruby. I'm so hungry. I'm glad we decided to come inside.
I know, I can't wait for that pie.
I really do miss the farm back in Vermont, but I am grateful that the Anthonys have let us live with them. Yes, it can be hard at times, and there are many days where I go to bed exhausted. But There are many mill girls who are not as lucky as Ruby and me. I wish all mill girls could be as happy as we are.
Margaret, what are you doing now? Help me make dinner. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
Happy birthday, Susan!
Yeah, unmute. Happy birthday, Susan B. Indeed. And a huge thank you to Faith and Hope Motta, as well as Marty Lohman, our museum's most proactive and skilled docent and cameraman for this production. That concludes our event for today. We hope you have all thoroughly enjoyed our annual birthday celebration for Susan B. Anthony and hope to see you all for next year's. Another huge thank you to all those who not only signed up, but who also donated to preserve this historic home. We are a small museum, and most of the work we do is thanks to incredible volunteers like Faith and Hope. We encourage everyone still here to consider making a donation to the Susan B. Anthony Birthplace Museum today. The link will be posted in the chat box below if you are interested. Another big thank you to Erika Bachiochi for her time today, members of the Susan B. Anthony Birthplace Museum Board, especially those who organized this event, the museum staff, Marty Lohman and Leila Pisano, Dorset Players for the beautiful costumes, and Linda's Lock for its assistance with the costume. Thank you.